The airport was alive with its usual chorus of rushing footsteps, overhead announcements, and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the terminal. Travelers shuffled in every direction, families juggling luggage, business people glued to their phones, and young dreamers nervously clutching passports to their chests. Among them was a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence, her stride calm but purposeful. Her name was Dr. Maya Ellison, and while to the passing eye she seemed like just another passenger catching her flight, her story was much deeper. Maya wasn't just any traveler, she was the chief inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, a woman who had risen through the ranks with brilliance, discipline, and an unshakable dedication to justice in the skies. But no one around her knew that. To them, she was simply a black woman traveling alone, dressed in a tailored navy suit, pulling a sleek leather carry-on. Her hair was neatly braided back, her passport tucked safely in her hand. She had spent years working to make airports safer, holding airlines accountable, ensuring that every regulation was followed to protect human lives. Ironically, the very system she had given her career to strengthen was about to turn against her in the most humiliating way. At the boarding gate, passengers lined up, some restless, some eager to be seated. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an impatient voice, scanned boarding passes and passports with mechanical indifference. When Maya approached, she offered her documents politely, as she always did. But the moment the agent's gaze landed on Maya's face, and then back at her passport, something shifted. Her expression hardened. "Step aside," the agent said curtly. Confused, Maya obliged. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone calm, even as a flicker of unease ran through her. The agent's lips curled in something between suspicion and disdain. "This doesn't look right. Where'd you get this passport?" The words stung. Maya took a slow breath. "It's issued by the United States government, just like yours. It's valid. You're welcome to scan it again." Passengers behind her began to murmur, some annoyed by the delay, others curious about the sudden tension. The agent didn't bother scanning again. Instead, she raised the passport in the air, holding it as if it were contaminated. "This looks fake," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Then, in an act so reckless, so degrading, it silenced the crowd, she struck a lighter and set the edge of Maya's passport ablaze. For a moment, time froze. The flame curled across the blue cover, eating into the golden crest of the United States. Gasps erupted from the line. Someone whispered, "She burned it." Another muttered, "Oh my God." The passport, the sacred document of identity and citizenship, the key to international travel, was reduced to ashes in the agent's hand, all in front of strangers, all directed at a black woman whose only crime was existing in that moment. Maya's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Years of facing subtle, quiet forms of prejudice had trained her in restraint. But this was different. This was not quiet. This was a public humiliation, an erasure of her dignity by someone who believed they had the authority to strip it away, and yet the agent had no idea who she was humiliating. When the fire was out and the charred remains of the passport lay in the trash, the gate agent folded her arms smugly. "You're not flying today. Step aside before I call security." Passengers shifted uneasily. A few looked at Maya with sympathy, others with confusion, and some with the silent complicity of people who wanted no trouble. But Maya stood still, her voice calm, measured, steady like steel. "You just destroyed federal property," she said softly. The gate agent rolled her eyes. "Don't play smart with me. That thing was fake." It was in that moment, in the hush that followed, that Maya's identity shifted from hidden to undeniable. She reached into her carry-on and pulled out her Fey identification, an official badge, gleaming, sealed, irrefutable. She held it high enough for the agent and everyone in line to see. "My name is Dr. Maya Ellison," she said, her voice carrying with the weight of truth. "I am the chief inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. I oversee compliance for every major airline in this country, including yours." The silence broke into a ripple of shocked murmurs. The gate agent's smugness faltered, her eyes widening as the reality of her actions began to register. But Maya didn't stop there. She took a step closer, her presence commanding, dignified, immovable. "You have not only violated my civil rights, but you have destroyed a valid U.S. passport, a federal document. That is a criminal act punishable under U.S. law. You humiliated me in front of these passengers. You targeted me not because of my documents, but because of the color of my skin, and you thought you could get away with it." The crowd was no longer silent. A man in line muttered, "She's right." A woman pulled out her phone, recording. The atmosphere shifted from passive observation to quiet outrage. For the first time, the gate agent looked small, her authority crumbling as quickly as the passport had burned. Maya, however, was not here for theatrics. She was here for dignity, for accountability. She kept her gaze steady on the agent. This airport, this airline, this gate, everything you represent falls under federal regulation. And I am the person responsible for ensuring that regulations are upheld. Today, I was not traveling as an inspector. I was traveling as a woman, as a citizen, as a Black American, and you decided that was not enough. You burned my passport thinking you burned my dignity, but what you set on fire today was your own career, your own credibility, and the illusion that you could act with impunity. Security had arrived by now, alerted by the commotion. But instead of placing their hands on Maya, they turned to the gate agent. Witnesses spoke up. Videos were already circulating online. The truth could not be silenced, not this time. Maya stood tall, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. She thought of her grandmother, who had marched for the right to vote. Of her mother, who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Of every Black traveler who had ever been questioned, doubted, or humiliated for simply existing. This moment was not just about her, it was about all of them. The gate agent, trembling now, stammered apologies, but they fell into the void of her own actions. The damage was irreversible. Maya did not need to yell. She did not need to curse. Her power lay in her composure, in the undeniable truth of who she was and what she represented. And as the airline's supervisor rushed forward, face pale, voice shaky, begging her to step aside to handle this privately, Maya knew this moment would not remain behind closed doors. It was bigger than the airport, bigger than the burned passport. It was a story about power, prejudice, and the fire that no lighter could destroy, the fire of dignity, justice, and truth. The tension at the gate lingered like smoke after a fire. Passengers whispered among themselves, phones still raised to capture the fallout of what they had just witnessed. What had begun as another ordinary day at the airport had transformed into something unforgettable, a moment of truth no one could deny. Dr. Maya Ellison stood firm, the embodiment of dignity under fire, as the airline supervisor ushered the gate agent to the side, her face drained of color, her hands trembling. Maya could have walked away then, satisfied that the gate agent's arrogance had collapsed under the weight of truth. But she knew better. Walking away would mean allowing the incident to be buried, swept under the sterile carpets of airport bureaucracy. And history had shown time and again what happened when such acts were allowed to fade into silence. They repeated, again and again, with another victim. Another humiliation, another wound to dignity. Not today. Dr. Ellison, the supervisor said nervously, wringing his hands. Please allow us to replace your passport, arrange for your flight, and Maya raised her hand, silencing him with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in boardrooms and on runways. This is not about replacing what was burned. You cannot replace the symbol of my citizenship with a simple gesture. You cannot replace the public humiliation with convenience. What you owe me is accountability. Her words were clear, deliberate, leaving no room for negotiation. The passengers still gathered, nodded in silent agreement. One woman spoke up, her voice carrying across the waiting area. She's right. We all saw what happened. We all saw what she did. Others chimed in, their voices forming a chorus of truth that could not be dismissed. Maya looked at the security officers who had arrived. Take her statement, she instructed, nodding toward the gate agent. The destruction of a valid passport is a federal offense. You know that. If you need my credentials for verification, you will find them beyond reproach. Her tone carried the weight of law, not emotion, though her heart burned with both. The agent, pale and visibly shaken, opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. The smugness, the certainty with which she had acted just minutes ago was gone. In its place was the raw, undeniable truth of her mistake. Not just a mistake, but a deliberate act rooted in prejudice. She had tried to strip a woman of her dignity and found instead that she had stripped herself of her authority. The crowd parted slightly as federal officers, alerted by both security and the viral spread of live recorded footage, arrived at the gate. Maya handed them her FAA badge and identified herself formally. Their demeanor shifted instantly, their posture straightening, their voices respectful. They took her statement with care, and as they did, she noticed how many passengers continued to film, determined to bear witness. Her words rang with truth. Stories poured in from travelers across the country. Black families who had been questioned unnecessarily, immigrants who had been humiliated at gates, women who had been spoken to with contempt. Maya listened to them all, her resolve only growing stronger. This was no longer just about her. It was about a system, about history, about dignity. The airline eventually settled with her, issuing a public apology and pledging to overhaul its training and disciplinary systems. But Maya refused to let the story end with a settlement. She used her platform to educate, to inspire, to remind the world that dignity is not negotiable. One evening, months after the incident, Maya sat at her grandmother's old wooden table, the same table where she had once done homework as a child. Her new passport lay before her, unblemished, its cover shining under the lamplight. She traced her fingers over the embossed eagle and thought of the flames that had consumed its predecessor. She thought of the fire inside her that could never be burned away. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "Baby, they will try to tell you who you are not. Never let them. Always remind them who you are." Maya smiled faintly. That day at the gate, she had reminded them, not just of who she was, but of who they were supposed to be, a nation that claimed liberty and justice for all. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew that every battle, every act of courage, every moment of standing tall mattered. The image of that burning passport would never leave her, but neither would the image of her standing, badge in hand, declaring the truth of her identity. One was an act of destruction, the other an act of defiance. And in the end, it was her defiance that defined the story. For every passenger who witnessed it, for every viewer who watched it unfold online, for every person who had ever felt small in the face of prejudice, Maya's story was more than just an incident at an airport. It was a reminder: dignity cannot be burned. Justice cannot be erased. And the fire of truth, once lit, cannot be extinguished. Months passed, and yet the echoes of that day at the airport did not fade. What had started as a confrontation at a boarding gate had transformed into a ripple that traveled across industries, communities, and even into homes where parents told their children about Dr. Maya Ellison's courage. For some, it was a reminder of how fragile dignity can be in the hands of others. For others, it was a torch of inspiration, proof that standing firm in truth could ignite change. Maya herself had not planned to become a symbol. She had always believed her role was behind the scenes, inspecting, regulating, ensuring safety from the shadows. But the fire that consumed her passport had forced her into the light. And once she was there, she realized her voice carried more weight than she had ever imagined. She began receiving letters and emails from strangers. A college student wrote, "I was humiliated at a checkpoint last year, and I thought I had no power. When I saw your story, I realized I'm not alone." A retired flight attendant admitted, "I saw so many incidents over the years but was too afraid to speak out. You gave me courage." Families sent her pictures of young girls dressed in suits, holding toy badges, inspired by the woman who had stood unbroken in the face of prejudice. Maya read every message, sometimes with tears in her eyes. She realized that while her work at the FAA kept planes safe, her story now kept something else alive: hope. Hope that justice, even if slow, was possible. Hope that dignity, though challenged, could never be fully erased. She was invited to universities, not just to speak about aviation, but about resilience. She stood in auditoriums filled with young black women studying engineering, law, medicine, and politics. "You do not have to be anyone's stereotype," she told them. "Your passport is not just a document, it is your life, your history, your right to belong. And when someone tries to burn it, you remind them that your worth cannot be set on fire." The airline involved in the incident tried to move past it with public relations, campaigns, but the stain remained. Every time their logo appeared, some people remembered the image of that passport curling in flames. And every time, Maya's name rose again as a counterpoint, an emblem of accountability. But Maya was careful not to let the story become just about her. She often redirected the attention to systemic issues, reminding audiences that the real work was not punishing one gate agent, but transforming a culture. "One person acted out their prejudice," she said in interviews. But the question is, why did she feel safe enough to do it? Why did she believe no one would stop her, no one would hold her accountable? That is the question we must answer. In quieter moments, away from cameras and speeches, Maya reflected on the personal cost of what had happened. She had lost something sacred that day, not just a passport, but a piece of peace she once carried while traveling. Airports, once symbols of her life's work, now carried a shadow. Walking through terminals, she sometimes felt the weight of memory pressing against her, but instead of letting it crush her, she turned it into fuel. One evening, while preparing for another keynote address, she found herself holding the charred remains of her old passport. She had asked investigators to return what was left, and though most of it was gone, the burned edges of the cover remained. Some people might have thrown it away, preferring to forget, but Maya kept it, framed in glass. Not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder of what had been done to her, and what she had chosen to do in response. She would point to it when mentoring young professionals. This, she would say, is not just ash. This is a story. This is proof that when they try to erase you, you write yourself back into history even bolder than before. The incident even reached international attention. In Ghana, a news outlet described her as a woman of unshakable dignity. In London, activists cited her case in debates about racial profiling in European airports. She received invitations to speak at global forums about aviation and civil rights. At first, she hesitated. After all, she had not chosen this path. But then she realized, sometimes history does not wait for you to choose. Sometimes it chooses you. And so, Maya leaned into her new role, not abandoning her duties as chief FAA inspector, but expanding them with a new mission, ensuring not only the safety of passengers in the skies, but also their dignity on the ground. Years later, when the story was retold in documentaries and classrooms, it was not remembered only as the tale of a gate agent's prejudice. It was remembered as the moment a woman turned humiliation into history, a moment when a passport was burned but a legacy was born. For Maya, the fire that consumed that document had ignited something far greater, a movement, a testimony, a legacy of resilience. And whenever she traveled, her new passport safe in hand, her head held high, she carried with her not just the weight of her own dignity, but the shared dignity of countless others who refused to be erased. Because in the end, her story was not just about a burned passport. It was about a truth that could never be destroyed, that no flame, no prejudice, no act of hate is stronger than the fire of justice, the power of resilience, and the unshakable dignity of a soul that knows its worth. Years later, long after the flames of that gate incident had gone viral, and the news cycle had moved on, Dr. Maya Ellison's name still resonated across the aviation industry and far beyond. What began as a single act of prejudice had turned into a lifelong mission, reshaping policies, inspiring legislation, and leaving a legacy that touched not just airports, but lives in every corner of the country. Airports themselves began to change. Training manuals no longer stopped at technical protocol. They now included sections on equity, human dignity, and unconscious bias. Airline staff were not only taught how to scan passports, but how to see people, really see them, beyond the assumptions of skin color or background. And when those reforms were announced, reporters often reminded the world that they traced back to a woman whose passport had once been burned in front of a crowd. For Maya, the years after the incident were filled with both honor and heaviness. She was invited to international conferences, received awards for her contributions to aviation and civil rights, and her name was cited in court cases as an example of institutional accountability. Yet whenever she stood on a stage, shaking hands under the glow of cameras, she carried with her the memory of that day, the sudden silence of the crowd, the heat of the fire, the brazen look on the gate agent's face. It was a scar that no applause could erase. But scars, she realized, were not always marks of weakness. They were evidence of survival, proof that the wound did not win, and Maya chose to wear hers with pride. One spring morning, she returned to that very airport, not as a traveler but as an honored guest. The airport authority had invited her to deliver the keynote at a ceremony unveiling a new initiative for equity in travel. As she walked through the terminal, travelers glanced at her with recognition, some even stopping to thank her quietly. A young black girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, that's her, the lady who stood up." Maya knelt down, smiled warmly, and said, "One day you'll stand up too, and the world will listen." The ceremony itself was a turning point. Behind her on the stage were banners that read, "Dignity in every journey." Before her sat airline executives, government officials, civil rights leaders, and passengers of all backgrounds. Maya spoke not with anger but with clarity, her voice carrying both the weight of history and the hope of the future. Travel is more than logistics, she told them. It is human. Every passport represents a life, a family, a history. When dignity is stripped from one, it is stripped from us all. My passport was burned, but it was never my identity that went up in flames. It was the illusion that prejudice could be ignored. Today I stand here not just as the chief FAA inspector, not just as a black woman who endured humiliation, but as proof that dignity, once defended, cannot be destroyed. Applause filled the hall, but Maya's eyes were drawn to the crowd, especially the children, watching her with awe. She knew they would inherit both the progress made and the struggles still to come. And she wanted them to know that courage was possible, even when the world tried to shrink them. After the ceremony, she walked past the very gate where her ordeal had begun. The carpet had been replaced, the signs updated, the staff entirely new. Nothing physically marked what had happened there. But Maya paused anyway, allowing herself a moment of silent reflection. In her mind, she could still hear the whispers, still see the spark of fire against the passport's cover, but she could also hear something else. The voice of her grandmother. Steady and unwavering. "Baby, remind them who you are." She smiled faintly. She had reminded them, and she would keep reminding them, not for herself alone, but for all who came after her. Years later still, when Maya finally retired from the FAA, her colleagues presented her with a gift. A glass-encased replica of a U.S. passport, engraved with the words, "Unburnable, unshakable, unforgettable." It was more than a token. It was a testament to the woman who had turned ashes into action. In her quiet retirement, she often visited schools, telling children about aviation, about perseverance, about justice. She would show them her framed passport remains, the charred edges, preserved, and say, "This was supposed to silence me, but instead it gave me a louder voice. You may not face fire in your life, but you will face doubt, fear, or hate. And when you do, remember, you are stronger than the flames." By then, the gate agent who had sparked the fire had long faded into obscurity. But Maya's story endured. It was taught in classrooms, cited in law reviews, and retold in living rooms where parents wanted their children to know that standing tall mattered. And so, what began as a day of humiliation ended as a legacy of power. Maya had proven that prejudice might burn paper, but it could never burn dignity. That justice, though delayed, could rise stronger than any flame. And that the worth of a soul, proud, unyielding, resilient, was a truth no one could erase. For every traveler stepping through an airport, for every child clutching a passport with dreams of the skies, Maya's story lived on, whispering through the terminals, "Dignity is not negotiable. Justice is not optional. And your identity, your worth, your place in this world, it is unburnable." History is often written in laws, in policies, in headlines that fade. But some history lives on in stories, and stories carried from one generation to the next, whispered across dinner tables, shared in classrooms, retold in moments of struggle when someone needs to be reminded of what dignity looks like when tested by fire. Dr. Maya Ellison's story had become one of those. Years after her retirement, a new generation of travelers filled the airports. Security lines were faster now, passports increasingly digital, and technology had made the skies safer than ever. But still, people remembered. At some gates, plaques quietly noted the Ellison reforms, policy changes that had reshaped the training and accountability of airline staff. Her name, etched into official documents and industry guidelines, had become part of aviation itself. But beyond policies, she had become something greater, a symbol. Children wrote essays about her courage. College students debated her case in law classes as a turning point in passenger rights. A documentary, The Passport That Burned But Did Not Break, was broadcast worldwide, showing the viral footage alongside her quiet, determined voice. "They thought they burned my dignity," she said in the film, but they only revealed it. And yet, for Maya, her greatest pride was not in the awards or the recognition. It was in the letters that still came, long after she left the FAA. Letters from mothers who told her, "Because of you, my daughter travels with confidence." Letters from immigrants who said, "Your story gave me courage," when they questioned my belonging. Letters from children who drew pictures of planes flying above fires, with the words, "Justice always wins." One autumn afternoon in her late 70s, Maya sat in her garden, sunlight glinting off the framed remains of her old passport. She had placed it outside not to mourn it, but to let it breathe in the open air. No longer a relic of humiliation, but a trophy of survival. Her granddaughter, Amara, ran up to her with a school project in hand. "Grandma," she said breathlessly, "we had to write about a hero today." "I wrote about you." Maya chuckled softly, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. A hero? Baby, I'm no hero. I just refused to bow my head when someone tried to erase me. But that's why you are, Amara insisted. She pointed to the paper where she had written, in bold, careful letters. My grandmother taught me that fire can't burn truth. Maya's eyes watered. She pulled her granddaughter close, feeling the weight of generations, her grandmother who marched for rights, her mother who worked without recognition, herself who had stood against humiliation, and now Amara, who would inherit not only their struggles but their strength. That night, as the sky filled with stars, Maya reflected on her journey. She remembered the sting of the gate agent's words, the crowd's silence, the fire consuming her passport. She remembered the silence afterward, heavy with disbelief, and she remembered how she had stood, not shouting, not raging, but standing, with truth in her hand and dignity in her voice. She realized now that her story was never just about one woman at one gate. It was about all who had ever been told, "You do not belong." It was about everyone who had been silenced, doubted, or diminished. And it was about the unbreakable truth that belonging is not granted by gatekeepers. It is inherent, undeniable, eternal. As she prepared for bed, she looked one last time at the framed ashes of her passport. To most, it was just a burned document. To her, it was proof. Proof that even when stripped bare, even when tested by fire, dignity had endured. Justice had endured. She had endured. And so her legacy lived on. In airports. In classrooms. In hearts. In the quiet confidence of travelers boarding planes without fear. In the laughter of children who grew up believing they belonged everywhere their passport could take them. Because in the end, Maya's story was not about a burned passport at all. It was about fire, the destructive fire of prejudice, and the stronger fire of resilience. And it was about a truth the world could never again forget. Dignity cannot be burned. Justice cannot be erased. And the human spirit, once it rises, becomes unbreakable. Decades passed. Air travel became almost unrecognizable. Biometric check-ins, AI gate systems, passports that glowed holographically. The world had changed, but the human struggle for dignity had not vanished. And still in classrooms, in boardrooms, in churches and community centers, people told the story of Dr. Maya Ellison. In one airport, gleaming, modern, filled with glass ceilings that reflected the sky, a bronze statue stood near the International Departures Gate. It was simple, yet powerful. A woman standing tall, holding in one hand a passport aflame, but in her eyes an unbroken calm. At the base of the statue were engraved the words, "Dignity cannot be burned." Travelers stopped to take pictures. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to read the plaque aloud. Some paused in silence, not knowing the whole story but feeling its weight. Others wept openly, remembering how far the world had come. Each year on the anniversary of the incident, airports across the country held a moment of silence. Airline staff wore small silver pins shaped like a passport with a flame. For them, it was more than a symbol. It was a reminder of their responsibility, a vow never to let power turn into humiliation again. Universities built Ellison Centers dedicated to research on racial equity, civil rights, and global justice. Young students, many not even alive when the passport had burned, found themselves inspired by a woman who had stood with nothing but truth in her hand. And for Maya's family, her legacy was even closer, more intimate. Her granddaughter Amara, once a wide-eyed child writing about heroes in school, had become an international lawyer. She often carried a copy of her grandmother's speech to the United Nations, where Maya had declared, "When you burn identity, you do not erase a person. You reveal the system that tried to destroy them." Amara spoke those same words in courtrooms, in conferences, in treaties. People called her the heir of fire, not because she lived in her grandmother's shadow, but because she carried the flame forward. One night, years after Maya's passing, Amara visited the airport statue alone. She touched the cool bronze, tracing the lines of her grandmother's face. The terminal around her bustled with the noise of departures, the rhythm of announcements, the laughter of travelers. Amara whispered, "Grandma, you were right. They thought they burned you. But really, they lit a fire that still burns." And in that moment, she realized something profound. Legacies are not about monuments or even laws. They are about sparks that ignite others across years, across generations. Maya's passport had burned, but her story had lit fires in countless hearts. Fires that pushed back against silence. Fires that told the world, again and again, that dignity is untouchable. As Amara walked away, a little girl nearby tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the statue. "Mama, who's that?" The mother smiled softly. "That baby is the woman who taught the world that nobody can take away who you are." The child gazed up at the bronze flame, eyes wide with wonder. And just like that, the story lived on. Not in ashes, not in smoke, but in fire, a fire passed hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. A fire that could never, ever be burned out. By the time Maya Ellison's story crossed oceans, it was no longer just about a gate agent and a burned passport. It had become a parable, a reminder of what it means to strip a person of dignity, and what it takes to reclaim it in the face of power. In South Africa, school children recited her words during assemblies, weaving her story into lessons about apartheid and the long struggle for freedom. In Brazil, her statue appeared in São Paulo's airport, draped with flowers from Afro-Brazilian travelers who saw in her story their own reflection. In Paris, an entire exhibition was curated around the theme of identity and fire, showcasing artists, poets, and musicians who had been touched by her courage. The ripple did not stop at symbols. Policy shifted across nations. At the United Nations, inspired by Maya's testimony years earlier, a global passenger Bill of Rights was ratified, guaranteeing that no traveler could be denied movement based on race, gender, or nationality. Countries that once shrugged at isolated incidents now held airlines accountable with real consequences. Journalists began to call it the Ellison effect. A single moment of humiliation turned into a cascade of global reform, but to the people it was something deeper. It was a mirror. Every traveler who had ever been singled out, questioned, or demeaned at a border saw themselves in Maya's burning passport, and every person who had been told they did not belong carried her fire as proof that belonging is not granted by a gate agent, a stamp, or a system. It is inherent. In Lagos, Nigeria, a mural stretched across a busy terminal wall. Maya's face, painted in bold strokes of gold and crimson, her passport in flames that transformed into wings. Beneath it, the words, "From fire, we rise." Travelers paused for selfies, yes, but many lingered longer, not for the photo, but for the quiet recognition that they were part of this story too. Even in the smallest villages, far from international airports, her fire burned. A farmer in Kenya who had never traveled beyond his region told his grandchildren the story at night. They tried to burn her, he would say, but they did not know she was already aflame. The children, wide-eyed under starlit skies, carried those words into their own futures. Back in the US, Maya's name had become shorthand for defiance with dignity. When protesters stood against injustice, they carried cardboard passports painted with flames, chanting, "We are Ellison's heirs." When lawmakers debated equity in education, housing, or healthcare, they invoked her name as a moral compass. But Maya herself, in her later years, often reflected with humility. She once told a journalist, "I never set out to be a symbol. I only wanted to keep my dignity intact." It was never about making history. It was about refusing to be erased. Yet history has a way of deciding for us. The burned passport was not just a piece of paper. It became scripture in the book of humanity's long struggle for justice. Generations later, her story entered school curriculums worldwide. Students in Tokyo, Nairobi, London, and Kingston wrote essays about the fire that changed the skies. Professors lectured on the Ellison Doctrine, a philosophy that argued dignity is not negotiable, even when institutions try to regulate it. And still, in airports, the fire glowed. Not literal flames, but murals, plaques, pins, and whispered stories between travelers. A gate agent in Dubai once noticed a passenger growing nervous during screening. She smiled, gestured to the small Ellison pin on her uniform, and said gently, "You are safe here." The passenger's shoulders relaxed. The fire had done its work again. Perhaps the most moving tribute came years after Maya's death, when the International Civil Aviation Organization unveiled a memorial at their headquarters in Montreal. It was not a statue nor a plaque, but a flame, eternal, flickering quietly in glass, burning beside the flags of all member nations. The inscription was simple. This flame will never expire, just as dignity will never be extinguished. On the day of its unveiling, diplomats, activists, flight attendants, and ordinary travelers from every corner of the globe gathered. In that hall of nations, they stood not as divided identities, but as one people connected by a shared truth. Maya's passport had been destroyed, but her humanity had been carried forward, multiplied, immortalized. And as the flame reflected in the eyes of thousands who attended, a collective understanding washed over them. Borders can divide, laws can fail, systems can wound, but dignity, once defended, belongs to all. The world had carried Maya's fire, and in carrying it, they had lit a path that no fire could ever burn away. Long after the fire, long after laws were written and monuments raised, the story of Maya Ellison began to slip free from the boundaries of history. It no longer belonged only to the records, the books, the archives. It lived in something greater in the bloodstream of human memory. Children in future centuries sat cross-legged around fire pits, in schools, in homes, and in digital worlds we can barely imagine, listening as elders told the tale. There was once a woman, they would begin, a black woman, strong and unbroken, who carried her passport through the skies. But when she stood at a gate, a hand of arrogance reached out, and in front of all the world, her papers, her proof, were set on fire. Gasps filled the air, just as they had in that terminal decades earlier. But here is the truth, the storytellers continued. The fire did not consume her. Instead, it revealed her. Because she was not only a passenger, she was the one who safeguarded the skies. She was the one who made sure planes soared safely. She was the chief inspector of the heavens. The children leaned in, their imaginations sparking. And what happened next? They would ask. The answer changed with each telling, as legends do. Some said the flames leapt from the passport and formed wings on her back, lifting her higher than any plane. Others said the fire traveled through the terminal, burning away prejudice wherever it touched. Still others swore the ashes of her passport rose like sparks and became stars in the sky, guiding travelers forever after. What never changed was the ending. The fire that was meant to erase her became the fire that carried her name into eternity. And so the legend of the burning passport spread across cultures. In villages of West Africa, griots wove it into songs with drums and chants. In Caribbean markets, poets painted it with rhythm and rhyme. In vast cities, theaters performed her story as opera, dance, film, hologram. Each version was different, but the heartbeat was the same. Dignity can be threatened but never destroyed. Over time, her name itself became a symbol. To pull an Ellison meant to stand with unshaken pride in the face of humiliation. Activists invoked her flame in protest for rights far beyond airports, in schools, in hospitals, in courtrooms, wherever dignity was challenged. Even those who did not know the details carried the legend in their bones. Travelers rubbed bronze replicas of her passport for luck before flights. Couples named daughters Maya in honor of the woman whose fire could not be put out. 1,000 traditions bloomed from one spark. And in the quiet corners of the world, where no cameras ever reached, the legend worked its most powerful magic. It gave courage to the forgotten, to the child who was told they did not belong, to the worker who was made invisible, to the exile searching for home. They would whisper to themselves, "They burned her passport." But she rose. In that whisper was strength. In that whisper was survival. Centuries later, when historians looked back, some wondered if the burning passport had happened exactly as told. Was the gate agent's hand truly so cruel? Were the flames truly so bright? Were the crowds truly so silent? Skeptics argued over details, searching for proof. But the people knew the truth. The story's power was never in its paperwork, never in its archived evidence. The truth lived in the way it moved hearts, the way it ignited dignity across generations. Whether history or legend, the flame was real. And so the woman with the burning passport became timeless. Not trapped in one airport, one year, one confrontation, but alive in every struggle for humanity that came after. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. For when the world remembers you not as victim but as flame, you never die. In the end, Maya Ellison's life did not conclude with fire, or thunder or applause. It ended in peace. She was in her garden, years after the storm of her story had circled the globe. The air was soft with evening light. Flowers leaned toward her hands as though they, too, recognized the fire she had carried. Her breath grew shallow, her body slower. But her eyes still burned with that same calm dignity. They had held the day her passport was set aflame. Family gathered around her bed in the days that followed. Grandchildren whispered prayers. Great-grandchildren clutched her fingers, too young to understand who she was to the world, but certain she was everything to them. Her daughter read aloud. Passages from Maya's own journals, words she had never shared publicly. Words about pain, words about faith, Words about the fire she had carried not for herself, but for those who would come after. And when her final moment came, it was not sorrowful. She exhaled with the quiet strength of someone who knew she had not been erased, not broken, not diminished. She left as she had lived, with dignity intact. The world mourned, of course. Airports dimmed their lights for a moment of silence. Planes grounded briefly in tribute. Millions streamed her memorial service, where leaders, activists, and ordinary travelers spoke of what her fire had meant. But the truest memorials were not the speeches. They were the whispers, parents telling their children her story, workers holding her name in protest, students writing her legacy into their essays. Her funeral was small, just as she had asked. A wooden casket, simple flowers, quiet hymns. But as it was lowered into the ground, something remarkable happened. A gust of wind carried a spark from a nearby candle, and the flame danced across the gathering. For a moment, the mourners gasped. But then they smiled, because it felt as though the fire was telling them what they already knew. Maya's story was not ending here. Her great-granddaughter Amara, now grown into a leader of her own, stood before the gathered family and whispered the same words. Maya had once told her they thought they burned her, but really, they lit the world. From that day on, her resting place became a pilgrimage. Not a shrine of worship, but a quiet garden where travelers, students and dreamers came to sit in silence. Some left flowers. Some left passports with handwritten notes tucked inside. Thank you for reminding me who I am. And across the earth, the flame lived on. Not in marble statues or bronze plaques alone, but in the smallest acts of courage. A teacher defending a child from cruelty, a worker standing tall in the face of humiliation, a traveler refusing to bow to prejudice. Each act whispered her name without needing to say it. The story had begun with a fire meant to erase her. It ended with a fire no hand could ever extinguish. Because the truth of Maya Ellison was never about a passport. It was about a principle. And principles, once carried with courage, do not die. They pass on like sparks in the dark, waiting for someone else to pick them up and carry them forward. So when future generations asked, who was she? The answer came not just from books or monuments or archives. It came from the quiet flame still alive in the world. She was dignity. She was courage. She was fire. And though her body rests, her flame still burns, in you, in me, in all who believe that no one's humanity can ever be burned away. That is the true ending. Not ashes, not silence, but fire eternal.